They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Kathryn Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. Former Families Commissioner and psychologist Dr Jan Pryor and her husband Jim lost their baby son, Alexander, 37 years ago. Alexander was their third child, just 4 months old when he died, leaving the family floundering in a gaping hole of grief and loss. Nearly 4 decades later, Jan Pryor has written a beautiful book about Alexander's life and death and what she's learned about living with grief. It's called After Alexander. Jan, good morning. The book based on your diaries from the time when he died, 37 years ago now. Why did you want to write the book and now?
I didn't want to write a book at the time. I've always been a scribbler, and I've always found writing a way of understanding an experience. And as I came closer to retirement, I realised that this story was still there, kind of wanting to be written in a way. And I also realised that if I could tell it, it would be not just telling the facts of a child dying, but it would be opening up this whole experience for other people who have very similar experiences. And it's not just cot death, it's stillbirth, it's miscarriage, it's even infertility in a way as a loss of a child. And it's the loss of anybody in a way.
It's grief, it's the fact you never get over it, but you learn to live with it.
Exactly. It becomes a part of yourself. And, one wouldn't want to get over it. That feels like forgetting the child. And, of course, you don't do that. But it becomes part of you, of your experience. And in my case, it changed me a great deal. I say for the better.
Learning to live with it and the various phases of learning to live with it and the experiences that others would recognise and go, yes, that was me too, in whatever circumstance. Is this part of it in some ways? Is it a gift to others in some ways?
I would be very happy if people did see it as a gift. I wrote what happened to me. If I hadn't written it that long after, I wouldn't have really understood what was happening. It was as I was writing that I began to see those links and threads that pulled together, for me in particular, for the family to some extent, that made us stronger as a result. And still honours Alexander's little wee life.
Getting launched tonight, I think, Thursday night in
It's
Auckland.
launched at the Women's Bookshop, yes, in Ponsonby Road.
Take us back then. You're a young mum of 3. You were in England where your husband Jim was working for a year as a GP. And as we said, Alexander was just a 4-month-old. It was an ordinary sunny spring day, any other day, until...
Well, until I put him to bed in the afternoon, and he wasn't a very good sleeper, and I had, with my sister, planned to take her baby and my children for a walk in the fields. It was spring, and I went up and he was wriggling, and I thought, oh gosh, I have time now, I can go down and make sandwiches. The children came in from the school bus, the other 2, and when I went up he was unconscious, and my sister, who was a nurse, resuscitated him, but she never brought him back to consciousness. And so I called my husband. We went to the local hospital, who didn't know what to do. They did a lumbar puncture. And then we had an extraordinarily nightmarish trip in an ambulance to London with a police escort. And he was on life support then for 2 days until we had to turn him off, really. This is not the usual experience of cot death, by the way. Most people find their babies in the morning dead. That didn't happen to us.
Unfathomable. There aren't words to describe the experience in those early moments, hours and days. How can you best describe the early time, realising your beautiful little boy was gone? Do you not even get to that point for a while?
You don't, because we had 2 other children to protect and look after and love and hug. We had things we had to do, which kept us from really realising. We were in shock, I think, but we behaved like automatons. There was a post-mortem, and then we organised a very inadequate funeral at a crematorium. And it was after that, when I was back in the house and the children were at school and Jim was back, that I realised just the shock really set in, I suppose.
must be a dream, a nightmare going through all those stages. And then you have what you describe as a huge Alexander-sized hole in your lives. And this is your reality. And again, in those early stages, what are the things that one experiences that you wouldn't automatically think of? The fear around your other children is one insight. The lack of trust in the world anymore.
All of that. At the time, it was the difficulty that people had in offering any sort of comfort, and then the difficulty I had in accepting it. And in the book I talk about people saying, perhaps the worst one, which was, it was meant to be. I found that incredibly offensive. People tried, some people avoided me, particularly mothers of other babies. It was as if we were contagious. The people that were the most help were the people who said, tell me about him. What was he like? Describe him. And who hugged me a lot and let me talk again and again and again and again. You just want to talk. Most people don't do that because you feel as if you're imposing on people. So that immediate reaction and experience was quite difficult. But it was a surprise to me that after a few months I began to feel very lucky that I'd had this little baby, and began to feel some joy in having had the experience of him.
That business of what people can say and do, I think that point you just made there is the vital one. People just want to talk about their loved one. They just want to talk. You're not doing them harm by bringing it up. No, you don't have to say anything clever.
No.
In fact, you're probably not going to say anything clever. It is just opening the conversation and letting someone talk.
Yes. It's very tempting, I think, when you're comforting people to say, do you know that my grandmother had a baby who died, and then go on and tell you about that. One of the more difficult ones was our next door neighbour, and I talk in the book, who came over and said that, well, my cat died, so I know how you feel. People are trying, and I'm not really judging them, but what I'm suggesting is that you can do better than that when somebody loses somebody.
And people aren't going to know how you feel. Nobody knows how you feel till they have had this scale of experience, but not to let that get in the way of reaching out and mainly listening. Talk to me. What do you want to say?
Listening is the big thing.
You also mentioned that the person, and this is understandable as well, I imagine, in the state that you're in, it's hard to receive anything that anyone is trying to give you. So what does that mean? Tolerance from everyone else, people being tolerant, that someone is in an extreme situation and be tolerant and don't be afraid of connecting.
It means that. It means asking what would help. I mean, sometimes it would be something like, let's go to the movies. I think, as you say, listening, asking some questions, open-ended questions, and asking what's going to be help. And of course, we all know that nothing in the end really helps, but there are some things that are very comforting.
That acknowledgement is a big one.
It is a big one, yeah.
You had to be kind to yourself too, and this took some time, and it's very instructive, the inclination to blame oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, for the children to take on a sense of blame, because everyone's experiencing this. Tell us a little more about what was happening within the family as people...
I think I was very unaware at the time of what was really happening. I know that my husband and I wanted to focus very much on the children. We were extremely protective of them. We did what I think we should have done, which was to tell them exactly what had happened. What we didn't say enough, and I can't offer this advice strongly enough, is to say to them, it was not your fault. And my older daughter, has even recently said to me she spent a very long time blaming herself because she thought she had asked me for a peanut butter sandwich and that was why he died. Children are egocentric and they take it on themselves, so please keep telling your children it's not their fault when something like this happens.
The blaming of yourself, I imagine, is part of that experience of how could this happen, what could I have done, and what sort of things were you doing to yourself and was Jim doing to himself at the time?
Well, to answer the Jim bit first, I don't know, because he went back to work and he was kind of expected to carry on. And here I was in my messy grief, not really seeing that this was happening. But looking after myself, I didn't really do very much to look after myself. I didn't know what to do, really. The children, we got on with life. I mean, we went for a trip in the continent in the van, and but there was always this pervasive sadness with us that went with us.
what is so beautiful about the book, and it's your skill as a writer, is how you are able to get us as close as we can be who haven't experienced it to the mind games and the awful repetition. But tell me about the sadness and its pervasiveness, and then, as we said, over time, how you began to live with a grief that would stay with you, or a truth that would stay with you.
One of the hardest things about SIDS or cot death is that there is no explanation. That's the definition of SIDS. There isn't an explanation for why your child has died. If my child had died of an infection or had been in a car accident, that would still have been horrific, but I would have known why. And not knowing why is very, very hard, and I struggled terribly with that. As you know, in the book, I explained that I'm, if not an atheist, I'm certainly agnostic, so I wouldn't and couldn't turn to religion as support. So I lived myself with that uncertainty of having no idea. I still don't know why. I have my own theories about it, which are to do with part of the brain not functioning very well, and I talk a lot about that. The sadness is just all around. You know, it's in the bed, it's in the meal, it's just everywhere. But at the same time, we were struggling as parents to make life as ordinary as possible for our kids, and it was after probably 2 or 3 months that I began to realise that the sun was still shining, that I'd had this absolutely delicious little baby, and that I was lucky, and I was starting to forgive myself, forgive other people, and realise that I was going to come through this.
We mentioned the children, and you mentioned they need to be told again and again and again, it's not your fault, it's nothing you've done. How difficult to continue parenting those other children when you are in the depths of despair? It's adding a whole extra burden to the job, and were you conscious of that at that time?
I don't know whether I was conscious of it, but I think in some ways it was a good thing. Had I been by myself, and I feel terribly for people who lose their first baby, that might have been even harder, yes, because at least I had a distraction with the children.
Getting beyond the guilt is the word we'll use, but the guilt and the continuous questioning and the what-ifs and the whys, does that ease?
Oh, yes. It does ease. It eases a great deal. I think the next big step in all of this was deciding whether or not to have another baby. And I think for anybody who's lost a child in this way, that's a very big question. I had to be very sure that I wasn't replacing Alexander, and I've again talked about that in the book a lot. The next baby was not to replace, and of course I knew I'd be anxious for the next baby, because it had happened, and so we had a very clumsy monitor for her, and I was worried, I was anxious, but I don't think I was over anxious. And when she was 5 months old, I took that monitor off her, and that was a wonderful moment, because I realised then that we'd all come through, and that we were going to be okay, that she wasn't going to die.
As I said, also that loss of trust in life.
Yes.
You know, this isn't things that should happen to anyone. It certainly shouldn't happen to me, and you lose your trust.
You lose your trust, but what I developed, Kathryn, I think, was something I call vulnerable optimism. After I'd realised that, I read Viktor Frankl, who calls it fragile optimism. I think he calls it fragile optimism. Basically, it's a much greater awareness of how lucky we are, what a wonderful place the world is, alongside that real awareness that anything could change at any time. And I find that's quite a good way to be.
All parenting is vulnerable.
Yes.
All parenting is a depth of love and connection and a dependence that someone else is going to be okay or you're not. This is just an awful extreme experience of that vulnerability. But that ability to live with it is, as we said, a critical part of the journey. And you found, when Esther was 5 months old, you were able to live with it more normally.
Yes. There was another thing, though, I think. I realised, and this was very, very helpful, that I had, and every parent does, no doubt, do something that saves a child's life every day. And we don't know we do it because nothing happens to the child. But I think we have to reassure ourselves that we are good enough parents, that we stop that child from running out in front of the road or falling in the bath or whatever. And that's a very useful thing to remember.
After a few months then, you began to see daylight again and sunlight again. Was it linear, however, or were there various times where you would go back into a despair? And what would prompt that?
It was very. I could never tell what would prompt it. I became very comfortable with my life, but there were a couple of things that happened that just took me right back. And one I talk about in the book was when I was on a ward round in a paediatric ward in Brisbane, and there was we were a group of us, and we came to a baby who was dying for no reason, and the paediatricians were very, very puzzled and sad, and I suddenly fainted, and I spent the rest of that ward round with my head between my knees. I'm quite sure that was taking me back to sitting beside Alexander dying. So, but that was 7 years after, and do I still? Of course, I'm still a little bit sad. I'm not triggered like that anymore.
The ripples of grief also that go out when something like this happens, and as you've become a grandparent, you've thought more about the impact on others, right? And again, it is so beautifully written with respect to being able to almost make us feel it to the extent we can, and we can't. But what more have you learned about the wider impact on family, and what more can we learn from what you've learned?
I was very touched when my son Simon wrote to me as an adult and said that he thought it had actually brought us closer, that shared experience. That was a wonderful thing to hear from a grown son who by then was a father, so he had some understanding. I think the grandparent thing is very important, and we ignored it at the time. His paternal grandparents turned up the day after he died, and they didn't meet him, and they were there at the funeral. My mother was in New Zealand. She didn't get to meet him or see him. And as a grandmother now, I'm very aware of that link that is between grandparents and grandchildren, whether or not it's acknowledged. And presumably his grandparents grieved, but we were too enmeshed in our own to really acknowledge that. And I think it's really important that I said something that the rope that binds grandparents to grandchildren can be heavy duty, but too often it's severed without full acknowledgement, and I think that's true.
You said it's changed you, and in some ways it changed you for the better. What came out of this that has made you who you are?
I had to strip myself right down to what I really was, not what I thought I was. I had to come to the understanding that I have a core which is very strong. I had to realise that the bits of me that I shouldn't be judging, and this is true of everybody, I think, that we do our best, and I'm strong for having come through it. I know myself a lot better. I'm not a better person, and I'm not a worse person, but I'm a very different person because I think I know myself so much better as a result of this. Not a good way to learn about yourself, of course, but that's what happened.
Living with grief, and there is the acute grief as part of a process, but there is a grief that, as you say, will sometimes get you, or that perhaps you carry at a lower level. We learn to live with, and again your experience of that has been an acceptance in some ways, an acceptance at different times that this is part of you, and as you say, you don't want to forget your baby.
No.
You want to be able to live with your experience of that loss. Again, is that really what the whole story is about?
Yes, I don't want to give the impression that I spend every day being sad. I don't. I spend most days feeling pretty comfortable with myself. Of course, I make huge mistakes. It's living with it. It's accepting it into you as a person, and not trying to deny it. There's a question that people sometimes ask, which is difficult. How many children do you have? And I have to make a judgment every time about what I say. Because if I say 3, well, that's true, I have 3 living children, but it's denying Alexander. But if I say 4, and if somebody says, well, who's the other one? That immediately brings up some issues that if I don't know that person at all or well, it's quite hard to handle. So I make a judicious decision about answering that question.
It's nearly 40 years. You went on to have this career in psychology, inaugural director of the Roy Mackenzie Centre for the Study of Families at Victoria University, former Chief Commissioner at the Families Commission. It's been a remarkable career, and now this book. The tribute that you pay at the end, the lovely chapter about what Alexander might have been.
Yes.
So remembering him not just as the baby you knew,
right,
but envisaging him as he might be as you carry him now. Would you like to read a little about that from that chapter?
I will, thank you. I think of how he would be now, grown up. He would be tall. Lankiness is in his genes. He would almost certainly be a brown-eyed, dark-haired, light-skinned man, since he was a brown-eyed, dark-haired, light-skinned baby. His older brother is tall, auburn-haired, light-skinned, glorious. His older and younger sisters are dark-haired, tall, and glorious. It is hard to imagine that he would not be glorious, but maybe not. Imagining him physically is the easy part. He would have grown up immersed in a middle-class mini-culture that assumed he would go to university. Perhaps he would have rebelled, left school and home early, taken his 21st century version of a knapsack and pursued his questions and dreams in less conventional ways. He might have taken drugs that addled his brain. He might have fathered a child at 17 or 15. He might have gone to prison. He might have been autistic. He might have been an artist, a musician, a writer, an actor. He will be none of these things. All his possible futures, his potential lives, died with him. We're closed in that small white coffin, but I can't help wondering.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book, Jan. Thank you. And the launch tonight, Thursday night, Women's Bookshop
in
Auckland. Thank you.
Yes.
Talk again soon, I hope.
Okay.
Jan Pryor, After Alexander, The Legacy of His Son, Headed in Publishing, The Publishers.